Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Gary Anderson, a professor of religious studies at the University of Notre Dame, to talk about his book, Sin, a History. Dr. Anderson, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
My pleasure to be here.
Well, we're a little bit out of the usual waters of what we would consider the What is Asia podcast, but I thought I would look a little more into the Jewish and Christian traditions, which come from West Asia initially, and sort of explore that a little bit more in depth on this program. You wrote a book called Sin, a History. In particular, you examine the evolution and the way that sin has been understood by Jewish and Christian peoples. So first, can you just start by giving a little historical context to this word sin? Like sort of where do we get it? What's that historical context around it? And then discuss the change in the meaning/connotation as you've laid it out in your research.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in a sense, I kind of stumbled on the project simply because I work in two different areas, we might want to say, associated with the study of the Bible. One is, the biblical text itself, and what I'm talking about here is what Christians call the Old Testament, or the Jewish Bible, sometimes referred to as the Hebrew Bible. And most of that text would have been written, probably most of it between 1000 and let's say 500 BC. If we were going to be exact, probably the range would be 1200 to 200 BC or BCE. And the language, biblical Hebrew, is pretty consistent, over that period. Obviously, that's 1,000 years, so there are some changes that take place, but the language has an integrity to it that can be distinguished pretty dramatically from the Hebrew that emerges in what we might call the rabbinic period, which coincides with the New Testament and the rise of early Christianity. And so most people who work in the field of biblical studies like I do, it's enough simply to work in texts from that period and deal with words for sin as they appear in the Bible. But there are some individuals like me that kind of peer over the edge of the discipline and look into its development in Rabbinic Judaism and New Testament. And there the language changes rather significantly. And the whole book, in a sense, revolves around how metaphors for sin, in particular, change when we move from the Bible to this post-biblical period. As many people know, language is very metaphoric, especially for religious concepts, which frequently are not, everyday items, and we rely on metaphor in order to talk about things that are not, concrete and historical. So in the Bible itself, the metaphors that are principally used to describe human sin would be that of sin as a stain, for example, or most predominantly, sin is a weight or a burden that one bears on their shoulders. So I always like to think maybe your readers are familiar with the cartoons in the New Yorker. I happen to be a big fan of the cartoons in the New Yorker, but people are probably familiar in that magazine or other cartoonists drawing an individual who's very happy, perhaps burdened by the sadness of his life, with his shoulders, for example, hunched over, as though there really was a burden he was carrying. If we looked at a picture of someone like that, we would know either he's done something wrong or something terrible has happened to him. So it's a very natural way, of course, to describe a guilty conscience. And that's the predominant metaphor in the Bible. But when we move to the post-biblical period, that metaphor is still there. It doesn't disappear. But its prominence, greatly goes down, and the metaphor that replaces it is that of sin as a debt. So that's the That's the basic contrast that the book deals with, is what happens to the literature, Jewish literature, Christian literature, as we move from a literary world in which sin is imagined as a burden that one carries on their shoulders, to sin as a debt that has to be repaid.
So just as you mentioned, original notions of sin were something akin to a stain or a burden, but then transformed over time into something akin to like monetary debt. Can you go into a little depth about what were the historical processes that caused these changes? You know, social, political, economic changes. Were there debates around this change? And amidst this change, were there prominent figures or groups who proposed other alternative ways of understanding sin? And if so, what did those debates look like?
So that is a great question. And my answer to that might be disappointing to you, because all of your questions, in a sense, are irrelevant, not because they're bad questions, but because they don't get at the kind of kernel of what I found. In other words, what we have in the Bible is something that's, we might want to say lexically driven. So metaphors we might want to contrast in this fashion. There are metaphors that poets or writers create because, they're gifted individuals. And we love, the way in which great poets or great writers are masters of the language and can orient the language in strikingly new and creative ways to reveal things about the world we might not have known before. A path in the woods, the narrow path diverged, and that's the path I took, for example. But that's, in a sense, precisely what my book is not about. The other nature or other way of looking at metaphor is metaphors that are embodied or embedded, we might want to say, in the dictionary of the language that we learn as our mother tongue. In other words, they're not up for choice. They're simply what we learn as we learn to speak a language. And that's what's true, certainly, about sin as a burden or sin as a debt. And that's what struck me, as looking at, dictionaries, both, for example, post-biblical Hebrew, Jewish Aramaic, Christian Aramaic. When you simply get the dictionary and open it up and see the terms for sin and also forgiveness of sin, they all fall in the ballpark in the Second Temple later period in the world of debt. So they're not, the metaphor isn't something that's generated or created by some religious virtuoso, some, especially prominent individual that then just catches on and everyone then follows in the wake of that religious genius, we might want to say. Rather, they're just lexically given, right? So they're not really up for debate. They're simply the tools at your disposal. Now, there obviously are means of deploying them in one way or another, emphasizing this aspect or that aspect. There's obviously, room for maneuvering, creative maneuvering within this world. But the metaphor itself is something that's kind of given by the culture. So, if you were to take an example, for Heidegger, for many people, they make a lot out of the way in which being, the notion of being, is expressed in German, es gibt, there is, but gibt comes from geben, to give, right? And that's something deep in Germanic culture. It's not something that Heidegger invented. He reflects on the way in which the expression of the idea that there is X or there is Y is expressed grammatically in German. Heidegger has no choice over the matter. What he's doing is reflecting rather on the curious way in which the German language expresses that something is, that something exists. And in a sense, my book is doing the same thing. I'm looking at, what are the tools that the language just provides without, the work of some creative individual to provide it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you know that too, working in Chinese. There's, idioms or metaphors that are native to the language that you learn in first-year Chinese. They're not up for debate. That's simply the way in which Chinese works.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the fun thing of learning a second language, is noticing the way in which different peoples from around the world conceive of things that we think are natural, but in very distinctive ways.
I found it interesting that one remedy to sin in its conceptualization as a debt is to partake in charitable giving or charitable action. Can you elaborate on this a little bit more? And also, what were understood to be the effective remedies to sin under its conceptualization as a stain or a burden?
Right. So one of the things, I wanted to do in my book was not simply to outline the basic root metaphors, but the way in which those root metaphors then became the basis for narrative stories that one would tell about individuals who fell into sin, and the way in which that sin then would be alleviated. So in the Bible, for example, the Jewish scriptures, it's hardly accidental that the major ritual that appears with respect to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is that of a pack animal, a goat, referred to as a scapegoat in the King James Version, is brought to the temple, and the sins of Israel are, as it were, offloaded on the back of that animal, and then the animal is sent off into the desert or the wilderness, never to return, as though all the sins, that animal bears are carried away and then gone forever. It's hard to imagine, that particular narrative, that particular ritual, for example, evolving in a culture for which sin was conceived of primarily as a debt. It simply wouldn't work. But if you realize that the underlying metaphor of biblical culture is that of sin as something that one carries, if we're then thinking about forgiveness of sin, it would be altogether natural to think of, someone, something, some animal carrying it away, right? And that happens. So then when we turn to the question that you asked with respect to sin as a debt, that the same thing would apply. Stories then emerge or develop in which, the taking care of sin is, correlated to either paying off the sin or someone releasing you. We might want to say from the burden of the sin. Think of just our contemporary culture right now with President Biden's proposal to release people from the burden of their, student debts. I think if I was someone with $50,000 in debt and someone was simply to say, you don't have to pay it off, I'd be ecstatic. And if you can see how, yes, a profound, experience like that, everyone would know the benefit. If someone said, I'm just going to take your mortgage, rip it up, you don't have to make any more house payments, I'd be ecstatic as well. And you can see why that would nicely carry over into a religious framework of, and we have stories certainly in early Christian tradition of the bonds of indebtedness of humanity being ripped up and no longer being required any kind of repayment. So those are the kind of stories that then emerge. And art as well. We have depictions of this bond being ripped in two, and Greek icons. We also see it in Jewish material, illuminated Bibles of debts being removed. So, and then, well, you asked also about charitable activities. Here we have a problem, maybe a slight problem of, what is the relationship of correlation and causation? So correlation, as we know, doesn't imply causation. So I can't prove this completely, but for me, it seemed hardly, accidental or simply a random action that we have this development of the notion of charity funding a treasury in heaven, appearing at the same time as the notion of sins being conceived of as debts that were also collected or recorded in heaven. So once those two things are in place, we can see how they would work synergistically very easily alongside one another, that one's charitable deeds creates a kind of set of credits for you in heaven that can easily off balance or set it right, whatever kind of debts you owe.
Just as a slight extension to that, I know in the Christian tradition, there's some people that believe, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, you can correct me, that when you go to heaven, you'll have a crown and it'll have a certain amount of jewels that represent your, sort of the good deeds you've conducted in life. Do we see that conceptualization of what would happen in heaven around the same time as we think of sin as a debt?
Well, maybe not literally that, and there are many ways in which, writers are going to relate, charitable activity to paying off the debts of sin that one has. There's a myriad of, different ways in which this can be painted or construed. But if you were going to think of, for example, Thomas Aquinas in the Western tradition, he would say that, a person's the differential places that, one will be located in the world to come in heaven, one might say, are going to be correlated to the range or degree of charity that you've displayed, on earth. So in that sense, you would be rewarded. Everyone will be rewarded in heaven. Everyone in St. Thomas's thinking will experience the beatific vision, and there will be no tears, so on and so forth. But those who have loved deepest and loved most will enjoy the, we might want to say, the benedictions of God in the deepest fashion. So yeah, we can see that. Again, it's not uniform, but it would be one picture.
In both the Christian and Jewish traditions, how does God react to sin as a debt? How does he, I guess, think about it? And in what notable ways does sin as a debt impact one's relationship with God? Are there differences between the way God is portrayed as reacting to people who sin in its understanding as a debt versus people who sin in its understanding as a stain or a burden?
Well, to a degree, yes. But again, there's a kind of range with all of these things. Many people, I think, have a prejudicial understanding of the metaphor of sin as a debt, and they perhaps are influenced, for example, by the picture of Shylock and Merchant of Venice, as though God were an accountant in heaven, counting every penny you owe and making sure that you weren't forgiven until every penny that you owe was repaid. One can find pictures like that generally in a kind of literary genre that's trying to encourage people to follow the narrow road in terms of, the moral virtues that you're to strive for. But by the same token, there's a way in which that can be, dramatically inverted. And again, that, if we were to think of the modern political landscape, if student debts were forgiven, that would, obviate the need to repay. So there's a lot of material both within Judaism and Christianity that, in a sense, set up this gradient of enormous obligation, only then to remove that obligation by some action of extraordinary divine gratuity. But it's hard to appreciate the depth of that divine gratuity if you haven't set up first this, dramatic, obligation that we stand under. And in a sense, the same thing would apply to student debts. The person who's released of $100,000 is obviously going to be more grateful than the person who is released from $5,000. We have that in the New Testament as well. Jesus often, says that, the gravest, most serious sinners will have the deepest understanding, we might want to say, of divine grace if they're open to it. because what they've been released from is so much more considerable than than the righteous. And we have a lot of stories like that in early Christian literature of talking about sinners of the most heinous variety, who, when they repent and are forgiven, of course, are so extraordinarily grateful because what they owe is so substantial.
Before we wrap up, one question that I'll often ask people in the history field, who are more often than not the people who I end up interviewing, but I'd like to ask you too. Just like in the history field, I'm sure that religious studies gets accused of being frivolous, impractical. Adjectives are sometimes assigned to it like that in history, and I'm assuming for religious studies as well, especially in a time when the world appears to be moving in a more secular direction and religion seems less and less relevant. What is your strongest argument for the idea that it is still important to engage with religious studies?
Well, I suppose there's two ways one could go here. One framework for those who are practitioners of a religion, of its normative expression, is that there's something that's fundamentally true about what religions teach. And so that definitely is the reason for studying it, is to hear what its claims to truth are, and to make your own determination as to whether you think they in fact are true or not. So that would be one reason. But the second reason we could say would be more descriptive for individuals, for example, who are, perhaps not as interested in religion as a practice. And that has to do with the fact that, if we look around the world, yes, the United States, Western Europe are very secular cultures, but we're minority cultures in that sense. If we take, a large enough glance at human history, and human culture. And one reason certainly for studying religion is to be aware of how cultures and people unlike ourselves perceive the world. If I could give just maybe one example here, maybe two examples. Peter Berger, who was a very famous sociologist of religion of a generation back, once described the United States as a country of Swedish elites. And he chose Swedes. I'm of Swedish ancestry, because at least when he was writing, that was the most secular of all the European countries. The Swedish elite, governing a nation of Indians, referring to the Indian subcontinent, one of the most, intensely religious parts of the world. And he said, he used this metaphor, as it were, or this image to speak about how difficult it is for people on the West and the East Coast who tend to be very secular, especially in university settings, media, newspapers, movies, highly secular, but very little understanding of ordinary Americans and their religious disposition. So part of the reason for studying religion is just to know, what the world is that you live in. But this can have dramatic consequences as well. I remember when I taught at Harvard at the Center for the Study of World Religions, there was a big conference about the problems in the State Department that attended the Iranian Revolution back in the 70s. The United States had, if you've ever watched the movie Argo, we had an enormous embassy in Iran, and had great access to the entire culture. But all of these people in the embassy were highly secular, and for them, what they wanted to know about Iran were facts related to the economy, the terrain, this, that, everything but religion. Religion for them was epiphenomenal, wasn't a primary generator of what happens in the course of human history, but it was always thought to be a dependent variable of real things like, oil or what have you. And of course, they were caught completely off guard by the revolution that took place. No one knew what was happening on the streets of Iran. And it was incredible because we literally had hundreds of people there, smart people, university people. But they didn't see that because, they had no understanding of religion. And that, of course, little episode has been, repeated, many times. And so I guess for that reason, it would seem to me that, there's a great utility in understanding religion, because it does animate, many cultures around the world. And if we want to know how they work, we should take some time to think about how those people think.
Dr. Anderson, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.